So how did we get here? Where are we? What's going on? The current lead and copper rule is currently in place and will be in place until at least 2024. It was drafted and implemented in 1992 and has seen a couple minor changes since then. So because of that, and because of recent issues that happened in Flint, Michigan and elsewhere, there's been an increased focus on lead in drinking water. And because of that, the EPA has been working for several years to update the applicable regulation. So that's the lead and copper rule. What happened is in 2019, there was a draft of the lead and copper rule revisions released. Several of us provided comments on it. And then in 2020, the final version of the lead and copper rule revisions were released. There was a change in administration from 20 to 21. So when President Biden and administration came in early 2021, they froze all of the previous regulations passed by the former administration, environmental and otherwise. Like this is kind of countrywide, not just this rule. They froze the lead and copper rule revisions, and they took pretty much all of 2021 to assess whether it's applicable, whether it's right, whether it's moving in the right direction, whether it's public health protective, all that sort of stuff. Had some stakeholder meetings, had some work group meetings, things like that, to try to assess whether it's good enough, too strict, all that sort of stuff. They decided in December of 2021 that they would be releasing the lead and copper rule revisions that would be going into effect October 16th of 2024. But in the meantime, they're going to be working on the lead and copper rule improvements, which is another rule. Timeline to be determined, but likely before October 16th of 2024. So what that means is there's the current lead and copper rule, the future lead and copper rule revisions, and then the future subsequent to that, the lead and copper rule improvements. This is confusing. This is a confusing time. This is the stuff that I do not have answers for. But the two things that I know are going into effect by October 16th of 2024 is the need for community and NTNC systems to develop a service line inventory, even if it's one line, even if it's a small school with a well into the building, that needs to be inventoried. And then systems that have at least one lead service line, one galvanized line that requires replacement, or one unknown line, any one of those three. Those systems need to develop a service line replacement plan. I'll get into about all the details on the inventories. That's what we're going to focus on today. And the service line replacement plan is a bit more straightforward. We don't have the templates yet, but we will be providing templates for that soon. So starting with the small bit, the service line replacement plan. So again, if a NTNC or community system has at least one lead service line, either full or partial, a galvanized line that requires replacement, and I'm going to tease this a lot, but I will get into exactly what that means later, or if they have a service line of unknown material, they need to develop the service line replacement plan. The service line replacement plan needs to include a strategy to identify any unknown lines if they exist. There needs to be a procedure for conducting full line replacement. We are no longer really allowing partial line replacement. It needs to be full line. The strategy to inform customers before doing line replacements. For systems that are over 10,000 in population, there needs to set a goal, which if a certain level is reached with their sampling, their routine sampling, then they need to replace a certain percentage of their service line, the lead lines, to be replaced annually. Then there needs to be a procedure to tell customers how to flush their lines and how to remove particulate lead from the system and things like that. There also needs to be a prioritization strategy based on certain things like vulnerability and sensitive populations and daycares and schools and things like that. For 5 and 6, the text that's in the blue, those are things that we will create documents for. So you'll basically just incorporate the state guidance to make sure everybody's kind of the same across the board statewide. And then there needs to be a funding strategy for conducting replacement of lines, especially for the private or homeowner side lines, if the private side wants their line replaced but can't afford to pay for it at the time it needs to be replaced. Right now, for the next 5 years, under the bipartisan infrastructure law, there is money for full lead service line replacement. There can be free money available to water systems that need to come into the SRF program and go through the process to get funding for those line replacements. But, you know, let's say in 10 years, if a lead service line is identified, that funding won't be there. So the system needs to create a funding strategy of loans or grants or otherwise to provide funding for those private side lines. Okay, so that's pretty much all I have about the service line replacement plan. Templates and guidance to be coming soon. They'll be on our website. We'll send out notifications and emails and stuff when that happens. So now we're going to drill into the service line inventories. So the things that are in red are required. The things that are in black are strongly recommended, highly recommended. It might not be required to have an approvable inventory, but it might be stuff that's required just to make sense of everything, or it's required for rule compliance later. So if you're going to spend the time right now to go through an inventory, you might as well fill out the rest of those things, because that will then really greatly streamline the process to identify a new sampling plan. So like when the RTCR, the revised total coliform rule, went into effect in 2016, we need basically every system to redo their lead and copper sampling plan, because the definitions are changing, the sampling locations are changing, the tiers, if you're familiar with the tier 1, 2, 3 other type protocol, that's all changing under the new rule. So every system will need a new plan. So doing the inventory and doing everything on the form will basically just turn that form into a paperwork exercise. If you don't do that stuff, then you'll need to dig back in and do research, which you've already kind of done. So we're strongly recommending, highly recommending to do the things that are in black. The really critical things we need are, there needs to be a unique identifier. We're relying on the 911 address, if that's available, and or the latitude and longitude of where the connection from the main is to the building, the latitude and longitude of both of those points. I'll get into how to find that. It's not overly complicated. I'll get into how to find that later. We need to know what the service line material is. We would prefer to know what the age is, what the size is, what the supplying water main is, things like that. But if you envision, there's the water main in the street, and then there's the system-owned portion to a certain point, and then the customer-owned portion past that. We need to know the materials. We'd love to know the sizes. We want to know if there are lead connectors, we need to know if there are lead connectors present. That means a gooseneck or a pigtail. I will get into this all in more detail. I'm just setting the stage now for the broadly what we're looking for. We need to know the history. We need to know whether if there was galvanized iron, if that's formerly downstream of lead, because that's important. We need to know how you identified the source, the material. We need to know the source of information to say, this is what this is. And saying, I've been operating this system for 20 years and I've never seen lead, doesn't cut it. You need to say, number 1 Main Street has copper. Number 2 Main Street has galvanized. Number 3 Main Street is this. It's that level of specificity. And like I said, so there's the homeowner, there's the water system section, and then there's the customer section. Same thing. We need to know the material. We really want to know the installation date. The installation date is helpful with respect to if you don't know what it is, but you know when it was installed, depending when that was. It could be lead or can't be lead, depending on the date. The important date for us is July 1st of 1989. If it was installed after July 1st of 1989, then it couldn't have been lead. So the installation date is important. Verification source, again, how did you identify what it is? And then we need to know for the customer portion, if you were denied access to the property to do the inventory. This, I will get into more details, but you will need to engage with the property owners, with the homeowners or business owners, potentially to see what the line is coming into their building if you don't already know. If they don't let you in, we really can't hold it against you. So you'll need to certify that you've had a good faith effort to get in, more than just like knocking on the door at 2 o'clock on a Tuesday when folks were at work. We need to know that you were denied access. And then we'd love to know internal plumbing stuff, because that gets into the sampling plan. We'd love to know if there's treatment present, because then that is excluded from being able to be sampled in the future. So this is just setting the stage, and I'm going to drill into these pieces in much more detail for the next while. So you might already be scratching your head and say, oh crap, this is a lot. And it is. admittedly, it is a lot. And October 16th, 2024 is a Wednesday for some reason. So it's nice to have a date in midweek. And it's not that far away. So how can we help? How can the state help in addition to doing the trainings and having the resources and all that sort of stuff? There's 3 different ways we're going to be helping. The first is we will be staffing up. We're going to be adding 7 new staff members to our program for the sole purpose of helping with the service line inventory related tasks. 2 of those staff will be working directly with schools. So NTNC schools that need to have their inventory done. We will be contacting you and we will be going on site with you to help identify this line types and to help complete the service line inventory template form. So for big systems over 1,000 or over 250 connections, those systems will receive a loan. They'll need to come into the SRF program and they'll receive a loan in order to contract with someone to do the inventory for them. These loans, depending on the system, depending on the municipality served, some of these loans will be fully forgiven, fully absolved or whatever. Some of them will be partially forgiven. It all depends on the specifics of the system being served. And it has to do with the disadvantage criteria and median household income and things like that. But just there's about 70 of those systems, and they can come in and do the normal SRF process and may have varying levels of forgiveness on that loan. For everybody else, the smaller community systems, so community systems under 1,000 in population, we will be setting up a series of contracts that we will be paying for to dispatch consultants to go to your system and help you complete the inventory at no cost to the system. So there's about 600 or so of those. You'll see that nowhere does this say they will do it for you. The system needs to be involved and needs to be engaged. Certainly you need to, if you have records, you need to find them and give them to the contractor in order to do the work, things like that. So, this isn't to say that there's not going to be some commitment from the water system, potentially a significant commitment from the water system. We're expecting that, and we're going to provide these other resources, either free or reduced costs to the systems to try to facilitate as best we can. Please stay tuned. We're finalizing some of the information about the loans. We need to get things together in order to set up the grants and the contracts with the state. So all of that is yet to come. Please be patient. I know that seemingly there's a ticking clock on this and folks want to get started, which you can absolutely do, especially after sitting through this training. But please wait. We will contact you when we have more information and we're ready for the next steps for this, for the funding or the assistance. So here's what we're talking about. This is a typical water service line in a typical community in any town, USA, which doesn't always fit the mold in Vermont. Vermont's not always cookie cutter, but for the most part, this is what we're looking at. This is what we're talking about. And to pause slightly, since this question is asked, and every time I've done this presentation, water systems only need to inventory the buildings and the lines that are connected to their distribution system. If there's a house with a well in your service area or in your town, that doesn't have anything to do with this. It's a house with a well. It doesn't need to be inventoried. We want to have all the connections off of the water system. So what are we looking at? Again, this is a typical world, which is Vermont isn't always, but we have the water main, let's say under the street. There's a connector or a pigtail, this little piece of pipe that EPA defines as being under 2 feet in length. This could be lead or not. So the connector or pigtail is under 2 feet in length. There's the system-owned portion, which is within the system's right-of-way, may include the curb stop. And then usually where the property boundary changes from the municipal right-of-way or the system right-of-way and the private property over here, that's usually where the ownership changes and now it becomes the customer portion into the building inlet. Now you might be thinking, my system is different. The system owns the entire service line, or the system owns none of the service line. That's good that you know that. That's really good that you know that. This all still applies. You just would probably skip a certain portion, and the inventory form identifies how that would work. So just know that if the homeowner owns the entire service line, you'd basically skip the system side and then just say what this homeowner's portions are. But for the most part, we're expecting this to be kind of the norm, with the property boundary being the change between the system owned and the customer owned portion. So for a little context on this, again, it's every community and non-transient, non-community water system needs to do an inventory. These are the systems subject to the lead and copper rule and lead and copper rule revisions. This does not include transient non-community systems. TNCs do not need to do the inventory. So between the community systems and the NTNC systems, there's give or take 176,000 service lines that need to be inventoried. And that's predominantly at community systems, 174,000 and change. There's 1,145 service lines at NTNCs. There's a lot of NTNCs that have more than one connection. I'll get into much more detail, but if you have a well that goes to the school, that goes to town hall and the town library, that's multiple connections. So that's where this would fall. Sorry, down here. So that would be 101 systems rather that have multiple connections. There's 150 NTNCs that just have the single connection, which is just the school or the factory, something like that. So I'm going to get into the number of buildings and the number of connections as being important, because we have two different service line templates. There's one template for single buildings. So if the water system comes in and serves everything all under one roof, that would be the single building template to use. And then otherwise, if it's a multi-building system, even if it's two buildings, that's the multi-building. It could be two buildings, or it could be the city of Burlington at thousands of buildings. Those would use the multi-building. So the single building is a really basic example of the well goes into the school, goes into the condo building. If all of the units are here under one roof, that's the single building template to use. Probably more commonly, especially for community systems, there's the well or the pump or some sort of, the source of water here that then just kind of goes cross country, and all of these 20 different buildings need to be inventoried. So each one of these respective lines, as identified with the black numbers and the black lines, would need to be part of the inventory. And that would be the multi-building inventory form. So drilling into our document and kind of what we're looking for, we need the 911 address. We need to know the location of the service line. Do not put the resident or business name. A lot of times for coliform sampling plans, and sometimes for lead and copper and DBPs, you'll put Quickie Mart or Jolly or the library. We need to know the address, because the Jolly may become the Maple Field, may become the Irving or whatever, and that changes, and that we can lose that connection. Do not put resident name, do not put business name, need to put the address. We would love for you to put the latitude and longitude on this, and we are not looking for within 2 inches of specificity on this. We're looking for kind of close enough. What we're hoping to do with some of this data, while it's amazingly helpful for you to know where these lines are, we're not going to be sending you out to dig here. We're not going to say, you told us it's this exact latitude and longitude, therefore dig there. We're not doing that. What we're hoping to do is be able to pull some of this information so we can kind of have some like shape files and rough idea of the water system boundaries and what the water system serves. We don't currently have that for almost all of our systems. Some of the big systems have that. For many small systems, I don't know who you serve. We're going to get a list of addresses, but it's going to be really helpful for us to be able to pull this latitude and longitude out and have a drawing and have a map. That way, if there's a spill, if there's a release, if there's an emergency and it's within your service area or in your source protection area, we will have more of that information to be able to respond and be able to help. It's also helpful because latitude and longitude can distinguish like where, if a building has multiple service lines, which I'll get into, it can help distinguish between the service lines. So like I said, you don't need to go out with a high specificity detailed unit in order to get this latitude and longitude. All you need to do is go to Google Maps, zoom into the location that we're talking about, and right click. So the right button on most mouses, the right click button will pop up this little window, and it will include the latitude and longitude. And that's all you have to do. It's really important. These are very specific numbers, that this is, copied or transcribed correctly. It needs to be within a certain range. If it's outside of a certain range, it's outside of Vermont. So the form kind of has those confines built in. And if it's outside of that, you'll have to redo it. It won't accept it. You'll need to know for the longitude that it needs to be this minus sign before the number. Otherwise, it'll be on the other side of the globe, and that doesn't make any sense. And we need to have at least 4 decimal places in this number to get to the level of specificity needed. You can see here, there's 5 decimal places, write all of them. Just write as many as you can get in. If you happen to say like, okay, well, I know I serve this building, I'm pretty sure the water system goes in over here, great. Or I'm sorry, the service line goes in over here, so click right there. If it's right here versus right there, we don't care. Like we said, I'm not going to send you out with a shovel to find that line right there. If you have no idea which side the service line goes in, just point it to the middle of the building. That is close enough for this exercise. That's close enough for this. So like I said, the form is built up with a little bit of logic in it. So if you put a number that's outside of Vermont, which this one would be, it will tell you it's between 42.7 and 45.1, redo it. So that's all you need to do. We're also asking for span number. This is recommended. I think some of them are required, some of them are recommended depending on the form. Span number may be new to you. It stands for School Property Account Number. So like your public drinking water system has a WSID, a water system identification number, like you have a social security number, the span number is a unique number that is assigned to a piece of property. That's really helpful when businesses change, or even 911 addresses change, or lots are subdivided, things like that. The span number stays the same. The span number carries on. So water systems are going to need to update these inventories every year or every 3 years based on the sampling frequency under the lead and copper rule. So because of that, this is a dynamic document. This is an evolving document. There will be multiple versions of this. The span number is going to be one way we can keep it straight throughout the years. So the hope is this is a living document. You go out, you do the inventory initially. You need to keep maintaining it, because let's say 6 months later, you go out and you do some meter readings, or you do some meter calibration, or you're fixing a leak here or doing that. Whenever you're in the field, or your contractors are in the field and they're seeing and doing and all that stuff, they need to come back. You need to come back and update the inventory with the new information that you've made available. So the span number will help us keep that straight. Span number can be easily found if you just Google Vermont Span Finder, but it's tax.vermont.gov/span.finder. You put the address in the search tool, and then you can come, or you can just navigate on the map itself and find the property. So I just put in 115 State Street is the State House. So that's this whole parcel and property here. So that's the span number for this property. Not as good for like big commercial things, because there's the court and some other administrative buildings for the state here. So those are all 3-ish have the same span number. But you can see through here with these businesses and homes on Court Street, each individual parcel has a span number. If I clicked on it, it would pull up the individual span number. That's what we're looking for. That's what really going to help keep this straight, keep this unique as we go. For most systems, the span number will be as individualized as it was in Montpelier there. For some systems, it's not. For some ski condos like this first one, let's say this is a public water system, there's 30 units in this that have the single span number, because this is one property by one developer and one subdivision, therefore there's one span number. Put the same span number for every connection on that inventory. Similarly, this one is, let's say this is a ski condo also. I see 5 different parcels. So there's one parcel here with 20 or 30 units. There's one parcel here that may not have units, but there might be more up this way. There's a parcel here in purple that's got 20 or 30 units, and then there's the one over here. So when you're doing these addresses, put this span number. When you're doing these addresses, put that span number. When you're doing these addresses, put that one. It's helpful, but a little less specific than when we're doing these sorts of things in the more kind of conventional community municipal systems. But it's still really important to have these to keep this straight. Then once we identify where the line is, then we need to identify what the line is. This is one of the critical portions. It's not uncommon to have multiple portions and multiple segments of the line. Not every line is a single piece of pipe that goes into from the main to the building. There might be changes based on leaks, or let's say the distribution system was replaced in the 80s and the system-owned portions of the service lines were all updated at the time, or there was a connector and it tapped into the existing. We need to know what those materials are. What we're focusing on are lead or galvanized or unknown. So if there's a lead portion, so the multiple building templates have one portion available for the system-owned side and one portion available for the customer-owned side. For the single building, there can be two portions on that line. It should be the same ownership, so we didn't break that down. So if you've got the system-owned portion and the customer-owned portion, you can only fit one in each of those. If there's lead in either of those, flag it as lead. If there's galvanized in either of those, flag it as galvanized. If there is neither lead nor galvanized present, let's say it's copper or PEX or PVC, or let's say it's a combination of multiple different things, put the material that is the longest in length. So let's say there's PVC that transitions to copper, and the copper is 20 feet and the PVC is 4 feet. Put the copper, put the stretch of the longest pipe that you know into the inventory. We're focusing on the worst case scenario, lead or galvanized. And if it's not those, we need to know what the longest material is. I keep teasing this, but I'll get into why the galvanized thing matters in a bit. We would love to know the supplying water main size. This is not required, but we would be very helpful for us to know. It'd be helpful for you to know. And again, this gets into that mapping where we can identify kind of what served where. If you don't have it or don't want to provide it, that's fine. But again, this would be helpful. All right, so let's start with the basic system. So we've identified kind of what we're looking for. Let's drill into the couple different options that we could have for a basic single building system. So let's just say it's a school for now. There's a well that goes to the storage tank, and then the pump in the tank that goes into the school. This has two segments that we need to identify and need to inventory. We need to know what is going on prior to the building inlet. So once that line in the building goes through a meter or a valve or a T or a junction or something like that, we need to know what those two segments are. So segment 1, segment 2. If there is a separate fire protection system that comes off of that tank and goes into the building as a separate plumbing infrastructure, separate firefighting protection system, this is called a non-potable service line, and this also needs to be inventoried. This is a head scratcher. I don't know what EPA wants us to do with this. You're never going to sample from this, but they want to know what it is. I'll get into a little bit more detail later, but basically the thought is this could change, especially if this is just like a designated like secondary service line that isn't some like black iron fire pump system. If it's just another line into the building, there's something could change in the future and it could be used. So we need to know what it is before it's used. Otherwise, if you don't have the designated fire system, don't worry about it. Segment 1 and segment 2, everything under one building, and that's it. Potentially more, yeah.
So the question is, so if this happens to be a line of concern, but it's on the fire protection side, we don't have to replace that. Is that correct? At this time, per the rule.
I think so. I think so. Yeah. I mean, if it's a lead line that's only for fire and it's only connected to a fire system, I don't think we have anything to do with it. I don't think it doesn't have to be replaced at this point in time. That's not to say it won't in the future. I honestly just don't know.
Thanks.
But for now, it won't have to be replaced. For other systems under one roof, the single building version, most often it's going to be a well, and the water comes into the building where it's treated or goes through UV or goes through chlorine that goes out to the storage tank and then back in. This is the supply line. This is the service line, because it goes the first line that carries the water to the building inlet. This is what needs to be inventoried. These little lines don't, that go to and from the storage tank, if they exist. Otherwise, if there's no storage, there's just the well into the building. We just need to know what the material is, and there might be two, because there was a leak here and something was replaced. Just there's room on this form to give us two different materials. The goal is just to track that line to the building inlet using the single building. If this is a school and then it branches off to town hall and branches off to the library, this is not the right template. You need to use the multi-building. This can apply to condos. Like I said before, if there's a well that goes into treatment and back out and goes into a single building that has 17 units under one roof, that would use the single building template. All right, so now we're talking about pigtails and connectors. This is more likely going to be for multiple connections. I don't really envision there to be many single building connections that have a lead gooseneck coming off the pitless or something like that, but crazier things have happened. We really want to focus on, this is the connector. If there's a lead connector present, that's the gooseneck or pigtail. And this is the piece of pipe that's under 2 feet in length. If it's longer than 2 feet, it's part of the service line. If it's the initial 2 feet connecting the main to the service line, that's considered a gooseneck or pigtail. That's the connector. So likely it'll look like something like, I don't know what I just did. Okay, hopefully we're still okay. It'll likely look like this. It'll look like this crooked S-shaped connector piece, and it's under 2 feet in length. That's a gooseneck. That's a lead gooseneck. Sometimes the goosenecks could be in the building, connecting into the meter and out of the meter. Sometimes you'll see these referred to as like bullhorns or something like that, potentially coming in or out. Most likely, if we're experiencing them in Vermont, we're experiencing them like this, which is connecting the main to the service line. A lead gooseneck is not a lead pipe if it's under 22 feet in length. If it's under 24 inches, it's a connector. It's not a lead pipe. It doesn't require to be replaced for the other just because it exists. However, the lead and copper rule revisions identifies that when seen in the wild, that these connectors do need to be replaced. There's protocol for that. There's guidance for that. We will have information on our website about how to do that. But it's really important, and it's a really confusing distinction, that this piece of lead pipe is not a lead pipe. It is made of lead. It is important to be removed. I'll get into more what galvanized requiring replacement means, but a lead gooseneck connected to a piece of pipe connected to galvanized is not a lead pipe, nor is it galvanized requiring replacement. And that GRR, the galvanized requiring replacement, will make more sense in a couple slides. These are the requirements for the goosenecks. I'm not going to really drill into this, but basically when you find them and it's system owned, on the system owned portion, they need to be removed when encountered. There's specific requirements. The system is not required to pay for the replacement if they don't own it, but they do need to facilitate the replacement. And then there is also additional public notice and sampling and filters and that sort of thing, because anytime you cut into this, anytime you're cutting into lead, it will dislodge lead and it will create at least a short-term public health issue. So much more to come on this. Don't worry about feverishly scribbling this down. We will have guidance on our website about this. We're expecting more systems to encounter lead goosenecks than service lines, to be honest. So this is important, and it is something we're working on. So, and now we went from the single building to the multiple building. All locations need to be inventoried, whether there's a service line to a vacant lot, whether there's an abandoned building or some sort of vacant property. If it has a service line, it needs to be inventoried. In a situation like a college campus, it might, or just even private subdivisions, the situation might be that the water system doesn't own the main going through here, doesn't matter. Regardless of the ownership of the lines of the mains, they need to be inventoried if they're served by the system. So again, like a big commercial complex or campus, or a college campus, or a healthcare facility that has multiple buildings that are private, and you may think, oh, that's got nothing to do with me, that's private. That's wrong. It does have something to do with you. Your water system serves it. It needs to be inventoried. That probably just sparked questions about consecutive systems. If so, I'll get to that in a couple slides. We're aware of that, and I'll tell you how the consecutive systems play in. So we talked about single buildings coming with lines coming in. This is a part of the multi-building world where there's multiple connections into the building. So, I'll use an example. UVM Healthcare in Burlington. I believe the main UVM Healthcare facility in Burlington has 9 service lines, has 9 lines coming off the Burlington system into the building. All 9 of those need to be inventoried. They all need to be identified by 911 address. And if the 911 address is the same, then there needs to be the latitude and longitude if it's able to be identified, and or some distinguishing characteristics. So let's say this is one Main Street and one Main Street East, one Main Street West, or north or south, or upper or lower, or 4-inch or 2-inch, or some sort of unique characteristic, so that when I pull this up in 4 years and say, hey, what's going on with one Main Street West, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about, and we will literally be on the same page. So making sure if you do have multiple services into a building, that each one is identified clearly. Getting back to the non-potable concept, if you have multiple lines going to the same building, regardless of the use, we need to know what they are. So let's say one of these is a fire protection line and one of these is the domestic drinking line. We need to know both. There is a separate template to be used for the non-potable connections. So if this system has a potable domestic line in and a fire protection line in here, they would use both the multiple building inventory to inventory all the buildings, and then also submit to us the non-potable inventory, which would just have the non-potable lines on the system. We don't exactly know what to do with those. We know we need to have them, so it makes sense for us to keep them separate because they're not going to be treated like the domestic lines are. So the likelihood is these are fire protection systems. These are designated fire protection systems. You'll log that it exists and we'll never have to worry about it. Maybe it's cooling, maybe it's irrigation, maybe it's something like just flushing toilets, just for sanitation and not for washing hands or baking or cooking or washing or drinking. I don't know, but they'll need to be identified if there are non-potable, designated non-potable lines. That will, again, need to be on the non-potable template that's additional. The likelihood is this is a big system thing. Most small systems won't have to deal with this, but City of Burlington, let's say they've got a lot of big buildings up there. They'll need to identify the domestic line in and on the normal multi-building inventory. And then on the non-potable, identify all the fire protection that they have going through the city.
Again, hey, Ben,
yeah.
Just to answer, somebody asked if we will go through the template later on. So yep. I know that's what Ben's talking about. I know he's mentioned it and it was a question. So yes, we'll take a look at that.
Yep. We'll drill into that in a bit. Absolutely. Okay.
You got about 15-20 minutes and then we should take a break.
Okay. Works for me. Okay. So we talked about 2 lines going into the same building. Let's talk about 1 line going into 2 buildings. I've been asked a few times throughout this process by operators that say, I've got a 3-inch shared service that goes cross country to serve 2 houses. For the purposes of this exercise, no, you don't. You have I forgot what I said, 3-inch water main that goes cross country that's then splits into 2 individual service lines to serve 2 different buildings. This is not a service line. If this serves more than 1 connection, this is a main for the purpose of this exercise. This is a service line. This serves 1 building. This is the water main because it serves many buildings. This is a water main, even if it serves 2 buildings. The service line is after the T or the Y or the split to serve the individual buildings. This is what needs to be inventoried, not the main.
Ben,
Okay. Yeah.
here's an interesting question. Our school has one service line to the building and then one to the school garden to water plants. How would we identify this? I'm assuming they're talking about the line to the garden.
Yeah. If the water comes into the school and then branches out and it just goes to the garden, I would say that that's just a single building and you don't need to inventory the line to the garden. Like if it's a drinking fountain at the outside of the school building or something like that. If it tees off of the well, like the line comes out of the well and tees, and one goes to the garden and one goes to the school, I would say that would be the multi-building, and that would need to be inventoried individually, because maybe
it says it's separate from the building.
So then, yeah, that would be the multi-connection. Because let's say in 5 years, you sell the garden and you put a building and you put town hall and you use that service line, hypothetically. It's a really bad example, not likely to happen, but it could. So we would need to have that inventoried if it could serve something else.
But if it was connected to the school, then just to verify.
If it came through the school and out, then it's just a peripheral use at the school. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Yep. All right. Let's talk about multiple units in a small number of buildings. So this also might be ski condos or just regular, condo associations or something like that, or a business park or a school with a town hall and a library or something like that. The water comes out of the well, goes through the distribution piping, which is number 5, to service line number 1, service line number 2, service line number 3, service line number 4. So what would need to be inventoried is this line, this line, this line, and this line. 5 is not part of the inventory. That's the distribution because it goes to multiple connections. And we also do not need to know what's on the inside of the building. So if there's some lateral that goes through the building and tees off to serve all of these units, that's not, for this purpose, that's not distribution. We don't care. That's internal plumbing. We need to know what this is, what this line is. So I know of a handful of you on this call. I'm not going to point you out individually, but I know some of you have this type of layout where you've got, let's say, a dozen units per building and a handful of units. We just need to know what connects the building. So for the inventory, it would be like A building, B building, C building, D building. Let's say maybe there's not a 911 address for the building. So it would be, Mountain View Association 4, and it would be A, B, C, D, and you'd inventory these individual 4 of these lines and then not the internal plumbing. Okay, so let's talk consecutives. If your water system serves a consecutive water system that we acknowledge with a WSID, with its own monitoring schedule, and we regulate it ourselves and independently, that system will need to do the inventory. If you have something that you call a consecutive that you don't manage or own, but you serve water into, and it is not already a public drinking water system, you need to inventory that as the supplier of water to that neighborhood. Because as far as we're concerned, that's just a neighborhood on your system. If the water system is consecutive exempt, so it was a consecutive, but there's been an exemption, even if you don't own it, even if you don't do the maintenance on it, if it's a consecutive exempt, it is part of the supplying water system's infrastructure that needs to be inventoried by the supplying water system. The line into the consecutive is not the service line. The individual lines to each connection is a service line, and I've got a diagram in the next slide to talk about that. And while we're on this topic, I'll bring up again the concept of the private lines. So if there's a private line or segment of line or mains, like a college, like a hospital complex, something like that, or just a private subdivision with a pump station that you manage the pump station and it's part of your system, but you don't do the repairs on the private lines, doesn't matter who owns these lines, they all need to be inventoried. Same way, like it doesn't matter whether the system owns it or the customer owns the segment, they both need to be inventoried. So the ownership has nothing to do with this. So let's look at this example. Let's just call this a typical example of a mobile home park that's connected to a water system. If this is a consecutive water system, if the WSID of the supplying system stops here, and that there's a WSID for this mobile home park here, or this association, if this has its own WSID, they will be responsible to do their own inventory of all these individual black lines here off of the water mains that are blue in this horseshoe. If this does not have its own WSID, even if it's privately owned, and there's a supplying system, the supplying system needs to inventory all of these individual service lines. This is not a service line. Like I said, a line that serves more than one building is a main. This is a water main. So the supplying system can't just say 4-inch plastic and move on. They need to go into each, work with the management, identify each one of these black lines here as service lines. So this may mean you need to work with the housing trust. You need to work with whoever owns the municipal, or rather whoever owns the park or the mobile home community, if it's supplied by your system. Again, if it has a WSID, you're good. But if this is, let's say this is Goddard College connected to Plainfield. Actually, that's a bad example. I'm going to take that back. If this is UVM in Burlington, and there's a bunch of buildings in UVM, Burlington needs to inventory everything at UVM because UVM is not a public water system. All right, so how do we know what these lines are? This is how we know what the lines are. Really, the best and easiest way is to do a visual inspection, or ask the homeowners to do a visual inspection that you can then confirm. So even if it's as simple of asking the homeowners to go into the basement or crawl space or utility space and take a picture of the water line coming into the building, and then sending it to you so you can make a judgment, or asking them to do a few different visual tests, which I'll get into. That's probably the best way. Does that only identify 3 inches of service line coming through the foundation wall? Yeah. And for now, if that's the only information you have on the customer portion of the line, that's fine. We would love it for all of you to have records, but we certainly can't make them up if they don't exist, right? So if you don't have records of what the lines are, there's a few options here to try to do the best you can. So certainly we would love for you to have maps and drawings of all your lines, as-built, distribution maps, things like that. Maybe different state permits have them. Maybe Act 250 has a master plan for the subdivision or neighborhood or municipality or something. Maybe the wastewater system and potable water supply permits. Those are the permits for each individual service line connecting to the water main. Those probably have specifications also. Asset management plans may have what's going on, where the curb stops are, what the service lines are connected to the curb stops, things like that. We'd love to see water system records, tie cards, meter inspection records, lister information about when the building was built, things like that. Then getting more into the visual inspection by the water system, by the homeowner. There could be the option to do swab tests. There's certain swabs approved by the EPA, and I'll show you a picture of what those look like. It's probably easier to not do swab tests, but that's certainly an option if you're in there and you just don't know, and you've tried a few different things. There may be codes or regulations or bylaws. So there may be a city charter that said in 1972 that lead couldn't be used after that date. So anything installed after 1972, even if you don't know what it is, wouldn't be lead because it was installed after the ban. So you can say unknown, but installed in 1974. And then there's a place on the form for some comments where you can say the city records or the city bylaws didn't allow lead after this date. So we don't know what it is, but we know it's not lead. That's something, that's information. If you just don't know, or if you've got conflicting information and you can't truth test it, err on the side of it being unknown. I'm going to go out on a limb and say everybody will have the best intentions for filling out this inventory. If in 5 years, it turns out that one of the lines you thought was copper is actually lead, there's no violation for that. You just need to update the inventory, and then we need to respond to it being lead. So it's really important you spend the time to do this carefully and thoroughly, but it's not a problem if some things are wrong. If the whole thing's wrong, we may have a problem with you just thinking you just phoned it in. But otherwise, we're going to assume that everything was done with the best intentions. There aren't violations for having a few wrong listings. But that said, when in doubt, err on the side of it being unknown. If you've got a record here that says it's lead and a record there that says it's PVC, I would actually err on the side of being more protective and calling it lead. But if it's PEX versus copper and you just don't know, just say unknown. The material types, most of the form where possible are drop downs. So you'd select from the list of drop downs here. And then you'll see, depending on the situation, if you select the right sequence, this galvanized requiring replacement on the inventory will automatically update. This is not something you can type in. The gray box is somewhere that you can't type in. This will automatically populate, and then we'll be able to query that and identify. All right, we'll do this, and this will be the last thing. I think, yeah, this will be the last thing before break, and then I'll touch upon it when we pick back up after the break. So, why do I care about galvanized? What is galvanized requiring replacement? Why is there so much focus on this when we should be focusing on lead? You're right, we should be focusing on lead, but we also need to focus on galvanized, and here's why. Galvanized, if it was formerly downstream of lead, can pick up lead. So that kind of turns that, it doesn't, not chemically and not structurally, but it kind of turns that galvanized pipe into a lead pipe. So if there's formerly a lead pipe upstream of a galvanized pipe, so the water went through the lead into the galvanized, that is galvanized requiring replacement, because there can be lead in the galvanized pipe now. If you don't know what this was, you can't say it wasn't lead. And yes, it's a double negative. If you can't say that this has never been lead connected to the galvanized, this is galvanized requiring replacement because it could have lead in it. This is confusing. It's complicated. It's a lot of double negatives. Basically, if it was lead or could have been lead, or if you don't know, and then downstream of that is currently a galvanized pipe, that is galvanized requiring replacement. So, unfortunately, I don't have 3 hands. If there's a lead gooseneck that connects to something that connects to galvanized, that is not galvanized requiring replacement, because the gooseneck is not a lead pipe. Only if this was, or you don't know if it was lead, or you don't know if it was lead connected to galvanized, is that galvanized requiring replacement. So this is a situation where a lead pipe is not a lead pipe because it's short. So it's a connector. So if it's just the gooseneck, it doesn't drive the galvanized requiring replacement. So
Ben,
lead gooseneck going to something, going to galvanized, doesn't matter. If this was lead and this is galvanized requiring replacement. If you can't certify that this wasn't lead, if you don't know what this was, and it's copper today because it was installed in 1994, but this is galvanized installed in the 60s, this is galvanized requiring replacement. Why do we care? What chemically and what can happen here? Yeah.
Hey, Ben. All right. So I know most of these, but I'm not 100% sure on some of the acronyms here, but is DI or CL included in the service line dropdown? We have a large FS line coming in from which domestic lines are tapped off? Basically, is
Sorry.
DI and CI?
One more time.
Is DI or CI included in the service line dropdown first?
No.
Okay.
It would be other. There's a spot for an other down here.
And there's a place to identify what other means.
Yeah. Yeah. Probably. Yeah. There is. Yep. I can get into that.
Okay. That's
we're
really
not
the question.
expecting. Yeah. There's galvanized. We didn't get into cast. We're not expecting to see a ton of cast service lines, except for maybe some bigger commercial buildings and stuff. And nor were we expecting to see ductile. I assume that's what DI would be.
Yep.
We wouldn't expect to see that. But again, if it's a bigger system and you have it, it would be other. And then there's a place to comment about other equal mean, other equals cast or galvanized, or sorry, cast or ductile.
And I have a personal question about I have a question myself. If you have cast, but you're using the logic that you were talking about earlier in this class, when it was installed after there was no lead lines allowed in the system, and there's no identified lead lines in the system, that would fall under the galvanized, not required to replace. If you can make that leap in logic.
You said cast initially. You mean,
I mean galvanized. I apologize.
Yeah, if there's galvanized pipe installed after a lead ban, either locally or the state, then you can say it was not connected to lead. It couldn't have been connected to lead. So that would be galvanized, not galvanized requiring replacement.
And right, unless something changes within the rule.
Yeah, yes, that's really splitting hairs, but sure. Yeah. Okay.
Sounds good.
So why do we care about lead connected to galvanized? What happens here? So lead can exist in two forms in drinking water and in a drinking water system. Either it's dissolved, it's in solution, which means it's just in the water. There's been a chemical reaction, it's come out of the pipe and now it's in the water and it's dissolved. Or it's in the physical form, it's not dissolved, it's particulate lead. It could be little tiny pieces that are just bumbling and stumbling and getting blown and moved by the weight of the water and the power of the water throughout the system. So the lead can exist in both of those forms. Doesn't matter, when you open the tap, stuff comes out, right? Either it's in solution or not. It comes out and then it's consumed. Our stomachs are acidic. It will dissolve the lead and it will both different ways will do the same thing in your system. The analysis by the lab, same way, it's acidified. They'll use acid to dissolve anything and then put it all into solution and then analyze. So we need to know what's particulate and, well, we need to consider the effects of particulate lead and dissolved in lead in solution. So the best way to think about this is if you put sugar into iced tea or sugar into coffee or something like that. You're stirring the coffee, you're pouring the sugar in. For a while, it just turns the coffee sweet. That's in solution. That's a chemically dissolved. It's now in the liquid. If you get to that point where the coffee's too cold or you put too much sugar in, you start to get the sugar to settle in the bottom of the cup. So you've got sweet coffee, probably very sweet coffee, with sugar on the bottom of the cup. That's existing in both of those forms that lead can. It's dissolved, it's in solution as the sweetness in the coffee, and then also as particulate as a solid sugar in the bottom of the cup. You shake the cup up, everything goes around, it makes the coffee a little sweeter, so it's in solution, and then eventually that coffee dissolves out and settles out and it's on the bottom. So that's particulate form. Lead does the exact same thing. If there's lead sources, so there's a lead pipe connected to galvanized, the lead can dissolve and go through the system, or the lead can flake off and bounce around as solid lead. The reason we're concerned about galvanized because galvanized does this. Galvanized tuberculates. These tubercules form, I think turb or tub, whatever, however the heck you say it. These things form inside the pipe. And if you're a system that has galvanized pipe, you know that if it was installed in 1972 at 6 inches diameter, it is not a 6-inch diameter pipe anymore. It may be a 1-inch diameter pipe at this point because of all this buildup. So if you picture solid lead, the sugar in the bottom of the cup, bouncing around, getting shaken up and going through the system until it hits these things. And then at some point, those just release or they flake off. Or there's a jackhammer next door working on the sewer line. It could dislodge this and then the lead comes back into the system like it was a lead pipe. We've seen situations nationally where this has happened. Washington, D.C. had a situation like this where they removed lead pipes in a neighborhood and they were still having lead issues because the lead was living. I mean, you can see how flaky and fragile some of this is. If the lead is living in these little bumps and nooks and crannies, and then something happens, water hammer, physical disturbance, even change in chemistry, introduction of inorganics, things like that, this lead then can go into the system, and it's basically like a lead pipe. So because of that, if it's galvanized that was formerly downstream of lead, or you just don't know, we're going to treat it basically like a lead pipe like this, and that would need to be addressed and need to be replaced. All right, so the galvanized requiring replacement thing, just to go over this one more time. If there was lead or unknown connected to galvanized that's currently in place, this would be galvanized requiring replacement, which is basically treated like a lead line for all the reasons I talked about here. So let's talk about really drilling into how to identify, how to do a visual inspection, what some of this means. I'm going to say right now that I very freely copy and pasted from many other states and cities and water systems that have done this. Some bigger systems are further along with this than we are as a state. So I was able to take some of their resources. So freely admitting thank you to those several cities and states that we got information from. This is all really useful stuff. A lot of this is in the EPA guidance. So I just took pieces and parts and put it into here. So let's say there's a gray metal-ish pipe that goes through the wall into the meter. How do you know if it's lead or galvanized? Few easy different ways. You can do the magnet test. Lead is not magnetic. Galvanized is magnetic. If you scrape it with a key or lightly sand, and be very careful about doing that because it is lead and getting into chips and dust and all that sort of stuff, there can be problems, but just simply scratching with a key, let's say, if you scratch it with a key and it turns shiny, that's lead. If it stays dull, that's galvanized. So you can scratch it, you can do the magnet test. You can also kind of plink on it. Galvanized sounds a little bit higher pitched and metally, and the lead sounds a little bit dull and low, more of a thud. Hit it with a screwdriver or something. This is from DC. Apparently they have brass service lines in Washington, DC. I don't suspect many Vermont water systems have brass service lines. So we're really focusing on, if it's PVC or plastic, black plastic or PEX, those are pretty easy, pretty self-explanatory, but more just the metals. And realize that the metals can corrode on the outside. Metals can be painted. So don't just assume it is what it is, right? So I think we've all seen copper in various forms, from a bright, shiny penny to the green Statue of Liberty and everything in between, right? That's what copper can look like. Solder joints are soldered or pressed, or the new crimp fittings, the new like special tool crimp fittings, or like shark bite, snap fitting type things. If you scratch the copper or come up, get rid of the paint, it'll look like a penny. Copper is non-magnetic. Lead is dull and gray initially. It's shiny when scratched. It's bendable. Lead often curves around things. One of the reasons it was used for so long. But lead isn't the only thing that can bend. I think is it K copper that can also bend a little bit. In one of my old houses, I was convinced I had lead internal plumbing because every single pipe twisted and turned and came around and went under the sink, and everything was a bend, but it was actually copper. So it's not across the board. If it's a kind of a curvy pipe, it's lead, but if it's a gray curvy pipe, it's probably lead. You're not going to get galvanized or cast to bend like that. Lead joints have this wiped connection, and I'll show you what that means. It's this big bulb, this mass of lead. Lead can't really be threaded effectively because lead is very soft. A lot of times, if you have a very high pressure system, lead probably can't hold on to it. So sometimes lead is not used in those situations, but not exclusively. And if it's more than 2 inches in diameter, the EPA says the likelihood is it's not lead, because it needs to be so big and so heavy that it might collapse under its own weight, and it's also just gets softer as it gets bigger. So lead is easy to scratch. It's silvery color. It is non-magnetic. Galvanized is kind of dark, flat gray. When scratched, it's kind of stays dark gray. It's rigid. The joints are most often threaded. It's hard to scratch, remains dull. And then, like I said, I'm not going to drill into the brass aspect. So here's what I mean about these wiped joints. This is that reinforced bulb here for the lead the lead joint. Most often you'll see this at transition points into something else. So this is a lead pipe. It also it curves out of the wall. It doesn't have a, an elbow junction coming through. So these white joints, sometimes they widen at the base, things like that. And then when scratched, it looks shiny. Galvanized is threaded, dark, kind of, dull gray, and it is magnetic. So a magnet will stick. Copper, you can kind of see there's the greenish corroded and a little bit of more gray corroded, and then just kind of the dull copper color. So that's what we're looking for. To get out ahead of some questions, I anticipate getting cast iron with lead packed joints is not lead. This is not lead on the wetted surface. So the free money that's available to replace lead service lines will not replace distribution cast iron piping. You can come into the SRF program as normal with part of the normal process. And if it's eligible and if it qualifies, you can replace these pipes, but these are not treated like lead. This is not part of the lead program with the specifically designated lead money as part of this process. And then to distinguish between cast and galvanized, cast has these bell joints where they're packed joints in between, not the threaded like galvanized would be. So here's just more pictures of the scratch test. You can see the lead turns shiny, the copper stays coppery, and the galvanized pipe just kind of looks scratched up. It doesn't get that shine the way the lead pipe does. Here are some of the swabs. They're about this big, about half the size of a pen. There's a little glass vial in them. You break them and shake them up and then dab them on the material you're testing. And basically, if it starts to turn orangish, yellowish, reddish, it has some amount of measurable lead. If you're going to go this route, if these things don't work for you to identify what it is, be really sure that you're not testing any sort of old paint. The likelihood with lead pipes would mean if they're painted, it could very well be with lead paint also. Be really careful of dust, be really careful of flakes, be careful of the mess you leave behind. I think kind of because of that, I would encourage, more doing an isolated scratch test or the magnet test. If you have a gray metal, you can't really be sure of, but this is an option. EPA has approved lead kits that they have identified as being applicable, and make sure you get the metal of the pipe and not any other materials or dust or paint. So by this point, you might be thinking, I don't have to bother with this. I'm just going to put unknown and be done with it. It is not in the system's best interest to default to unknown. Unknown has to be used. There are times when you don't know. You don't know what the system, what the either portion of the lines are. You don't have the record, something happened, whatever. That's fine. I'm not saying you can't use unknown, but don't default to unknown. Because what happens is, let's fast forward 10 years. If the water system has a lead action level exceedance, they will need to replace, let's say 10 lead service lines per year, every year until all the lead service lines are gone. So let's say they have a lead action level exceedance. We look at the list of the lead service lines. Let's say that there's documented lead lines and unknown lines. For this purpose, all of those unknown and lead lines will need to be identified and replaced. Well, maybe not replaced, but at least identified for replacement. So if you need to replace at least 10 lines and you dig into, and the first 4 were unknown, but they turn out to be copper, that's great. You now know that they're copper, but you don't get any credit under the rule for doing any work on those 4 lines. So you'll need to then keep digging until you find the lead lines to be removed. So it could be a compliance issue in the future if you just say, they're all unknown, I'm not going to bother. Because then if there's an issue in the future, you won't get credit for replacing those lines. And therefore you'll be in non-compliance because you'll have lead lines that you're not finding and digging up. I don't know exactly what's going to happen in the future. I don't have a crystal ball, but I'm fairly certain the lead standard will be lowering in the future. So just because you haven't had a lead issue in the past doesn't mean you can't and won't have a lead issue in the future. The way the sampling is done could be changing. The way the locations are picked to sample could change. And then certainly the standard could change. So you could start to have lead problems or lead action levels in exceedances in the future. And then this will all trip in and you could be in non-compliance for not identifying the unknowns.
Somebody just pointed out, Ben, that painted pipes may also contain PCBs if historical concrete ceiling floor paint was used. Just a statement.
Okay, yeah, that's good to know. I wasn't aware, I wasn't paying attention to that, but yeah, certainly could be. So I would opt for the less invasive ways to do this, the tapping and the magnet and the isolated scratch versus, you know, really opening it up. And that's another reason to be careful.
Yep. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. So like the question was asked, if you do identify them as unknown for now, what happens next? So, you know, once the inventories are done, we'll catch our breath, we'll see what we're facing, and then we've got some money available to get into some sampling protocols, some, you know, the next possible steps for digging and things like that. We are not expecting any of this now. I just want to state that repeatedly, that we do not want people to dig right now to identify what the service lines are, because if you dig down and you see lead, you need to do something about it right then and there. You've already disturbed it. You've already created a problem. So if you just cover back up and wait 4 years, you've created a problem. It's great that you know what it is, but it's just, we're not wanting that. If we want you to be engaged, ready, dispatched with materials on hand to do this type of work before you literally dig into it. So just know, we might be getting into that. There might be some more exploratory and more invasive ways to do it, but it is very problematic and you need to do it right. So don't just start digging holes, please. Talking about the sampling. And again, I only bring this up for your awareness. We are not wanting people to sample right now. Sampling can be really helpful. Sampling can be very useful to identify where there is lead. The problem is it's not always useful to identify where there isn't lead. For several reasons, the lead pipes might not show up in a test, which doesn't mean it's not lead. It just means there wasn't lead coming into the water. If the system has adequate corrosion control, if there's a phosphate inhibitor, we would like to not see lead. We would expect to see less lead. Certainly if you take, so this picture is showing sequential sampling where you just take bottle after bottle after bottle after bottle, and you work through the faucet, the internal plumbing, the service line, and eventually you get to the main. So if you start to see these results that go low, 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 high, 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 low, 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 you know the high had some amount of lead in it, and you can say, well, maybe that's here, and it's a partial lead line. The problem is if they all stay low, that doesn't guarantee there isn't lead. It could be indicative of treatment working. Even honestly, we've heard from other systems that have a high chlorine residual and lead pipes can actually be a good thing because the chlorine oxidizes the inside of the lead so that it is more stable and less likely to react. So even just chlorine sometimes can be a mask for the lead pipe. So just because you sample and it's low doesn't mean it isn't lead. If you sample and it's high, it likely means that it is lead. So it's very conditional. It's very system specific. It's very situational specific. And also if you sample, the likelihood is, you should understand what the line is. So it might mean digging up a few lines so that you can then sample, so you can get a baseline for your system. So this is very complicated. There's a lot going on. There are a handful of consultants out there that can do this. It's not foreign. It's not, completely an impossibility, but we don't want this happening now. We will engage with this in the future when the time is right. If your system has widespread unknowns or galvanized requirement replacements or this and that, we will work with you to try to identify how to do the next few steps.
So Ben, somebody said it's a statement more than anything else, and it's just something to think about. What if you had a bad lead sample and then all of a sudden you have like 10 bad lead samples and you have to replace 10 lines? What if the bad sample was caused by a fixture that had old brass in it or something else, and you had no lead lines in the end? Would you have to dig up every service line until they were all identified?
It's getting into the weeds of the rule, and the real specifics aren't known. I mean, there's a lot of depends. So I'm going to say for now, maybe it's possible. We would hope that we would be able to do some more investigative sampling. We would have a better sense of understanding what's going on. And also, I can't predict exactly how the rule will shake out for this. So it's possible that that could happen.
So at this time, it appears as though if we're using other ways of logically identifying the lines without digging them up, it's not outside the realm that may not have to happen.
It's possible. You won't have to dig anything up until at least 2024, 2025 in terms of replacement. So we'll have a better sense when that happens as to what to do. The rule currently, and this is part of it is changing, has like a find and fix, similar to what the revised total coliform rule has, where if there's elevated results, you kind of go try to figure out why. And then that response can be used as part of the next steps. So it's not categorically, okay, dig. There could be some investigative stuff, but EPA has said that they may be changing the way they do that. So that's why I unfortunately, I can't give you a straight answer.
Oh, I get it. I hope they do. Somebody else said, nope. Okay, moving on.
Okay. So yeah, getting into the excavation, you might see reference to this as digging or potholing using a hydrovac. Again, it's expensive, it's invasive, it's disruptive. If you're wanting this to address service lines and you find them, you need to address them immediately. And I went into this whole song and dance already. So just wait, please wait. Just so you're aware, these need to be publicly accessible. So publicly accessible for systems under 50,000 in size just means you need to have it available should people request it, either to email it to them or they can come take a look at it in water system offices. Systems over 50,000 in size need to put it on their website. It needs to be publicly accessible and reviewable. There are some really great resources out there for mapping. Washington, D.C. has one. Bennington, Vermont has a really good mapping program online that their current program is using to address and remove lead lines. It's a work in progress. All of them are works in progress as we learn. So you can't take them as gospel because they may be outdated or they may find information that in the future that changes things. But anyway, if you want to get into the mapping thing, that's great. You don't have to. You just need to have the inventory on your website if you're that big. Like I said before, these are living documents. The inventories need to be reviewed constantly and updated constantly. They will need to be submitted to us every year or every 3 years based on what your sampling frequency is, so we can be sure that you're sampling at the right locations every time, because we need to focus on lead service lines or galvanized requiring replacement lines and things like that if they exist. So this isn't a one and done. This isn't just do it to satisfy the state and move on. This is something you need to have at your fingertips routinely so that you can say, I did a meter swap out and I saw this. Go back and say what you saw and put it in the next version of the inventory. It's really important that this be living and this be an evolving thing, and it's not just once and then it just sits on a shelf, because we will require it to be submitted. Like I said, this is just the funding again, about increasing the division staff to do the work with NTNC schools for forgivable loans up to a certain point based on the system specific and municipal system specific information. And then the system serving under 1,000 people will have contractors paid by the state to assist in this. We will have this kind of standard state process for requests for proposals to solicit bids for people to come into this. And then we will also similarly kind of like solicit systems and assign systems to contractors. We will be in touch. We will be working on this. If you're interested, just stay tuned. Much more to come on all these details in the near future. Just some words on federal funding, just as a caution that federal money will not and cannot go towards partial line replacement, only full lead service line replacement. Federal money cannot go towards plumbing or fixture replacement in community systems, but it could go towards plumbing and replacement at nonprofit, non-community systems, so NTNC schools, assuming it meets everything else with the SRF program. So if the question about, well, with one bad sample with a bad brass in a faucet, the system can't get loans from us to replace that faucet. The system will need to do that out of its budget, or the homeowner will need to replace it or something, unless it's in a nonprofit NTNC system. Then it could if it's eligible, if it meets the funding requirements, all that sort of stuff under the SRF program. We've got a bunch of information about lead in schools. You may have heard about this. This is certainly something that is important, and it gets a lot of press and media coverage and political discussions and things like that. The way the current lead and copper rule revisions are written, the water system is required to do sampling within schools that they serve. Normally, you're not sampling there because you're sampling at single family homes to assess what's going on. But the rule requires some sampling in schools at a certain frequency based on a certain number of taps and all this and that. So if it's served by the system. If the school is its own system, it is an NTNC, it has its own complications. One of the real reasons I bring this up is just to realize that this is all changing. And this is a really awesome graphic that Josh and Kelsey and our team created. But if you see reference to schools in the lead and copper rule revisions and discussions, just know that it is likely changing. This is different. Everything I've said so far for the last hour and however long is different than the state program for sampling at schools and childcares. There's currently state regulations that require the sampling at every tap used for consumption at schools and childcares in the state, whether they're a public system or not, whether they're served by a public system or not. That is completely separate and has nothing to do with the lead and copper rule or lead and copper rule revisions. So you may think, oh, there's this new lead and copper rule because you have to sample at schools. Maybe, but probably not. The takeaway with all of this about schools is it's in the current rule, no, it's not. It's in the revised rule, which will likely be changed for the improved rule. We don't know what it says, but it almost doesn't matter in Vermont because we have our own state regulation for sampling at schools and childcares that we think, we're pretty confident that it will be more stringent than whatever the lead and copper rule requires. Therefore, the systems will not need to deal with it because the schools will be doing it with the health department program themselves. So just realize that for now. Yeah.
Somebody asked, a ski resort is privately owned system. Would they be eligible to apply for a loan or some of the financing?
This is a community for-profit system, then Megan can correct me, but I think communities are in regardless. It's just the nonprofit non-communities is where that line is drawn.
That is correct, but as a reminder that if you are a water system that serves a population of 1,000 or less, we will be offering free contract services so that you don't have to apply for a loan. Usually, if we're talking about a ski resort condo association, they're probably not that many, so they'll probably qualify for the contract services. But if they would like to apply for a loan and hire their own consultant, they can. We just cannot guarantee that it would be 100% forgiven.
Yeah, if we're talking about the folks from Bromley that is over 1,000 and is private, that's just the loan process.
Correct.
And then Josh was nice enough to, if you have to note that if you have questions about the system, your system that you represent and interact with Act 66, to call Josh, and his number is 802-261-1360. It's right in the chat menu, everybody. But if you need that, or if for some reason you wrote it down, but then you lost the piece of paper and you want to remember how to find him and who it was, feel free to reach out to Ben, to Janelle, or to myself, and I'll happily pass you off to Josh. I know I don't work for the Drinking Water Groundwater Protection Division, but we all are working together to try to make this work for everyone. So thanks, Josh, for offering up your phone number. You may regret that later on.
It's public.
Yeah.
All right. So I don't think I've stressed this yet, but this is very important, that the document needs to be maintained electronically and submitted to us electronically. There are 27 or 28 columns of information per address that need to be filled out or asked to be filled out. I mean, this could be, city, state, zip. So that's 3 different columns, but there's that type of information that we're asking for. So because of that, you can't print this out. You can't submit it to us and scotch tape it together, all that sort of stuff. That doesn't work. It needs to be done electronically and submitted to us electronically. Hopefully with the contractors being out there, that can provide some assistance if you have less experience with Excel, with Microsoft Excel and some other things. I believe rural water is going to try to do a few things with respect to some trainings for Excel. And, Matt sat through these now and he's seen kind of what we're asking for, so he can kind of train to this document a little bit also. But it needs to be done electronically, and it needs to be submitted to us electronically using A&R Online. Some of you may be wastewater operators and you submit your DMRs to the wastewater program. It's the same deal. It's just a different form. It's different paperwork that comes to us. There's some key required information that needs to come to us that you will need to put in your WSID. The water system name will probably populate because of that. The date you complete the inventory, who completes the inventory, and then these answers to these blanks will be there that you need to fill in. And this table is part of the inventory that will automatically count and calculate. So all you need to do is just kind of spit these back out to us, because this is the stuff that needs to go to the EPA. You need to fill out the inventory so that we can give these numbers to EPA so that they can be aware of how many lead lines, how many galvanized, and all that. So it's a secure way to log in and send it to us. That we will have, we're very close to finishing that program. We will have a little video on how to do this specifically for this form, and then other handouts to make this easier. We will provide them to you. We will let you know when it's ready. So we're going to dig into the document now. This is a bunch of stuff that you don't need to worry about, but let me pull up the document. So we'll start basically with the single building inventory. So this is kind of already completed. I've got some information in there. So let's say single building inventory, WSID is 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever. Water system name, the date you complete the document, and then who completes it.
So
this then,
Ben, I think you've already said this, but I want to make sure it's clear. They asked, does it need to be submitted using the Excel spreadsheet provided, or can it be in some other form as long as it has all the information?
it needs to be in our form.
Yeah. So they need to be able to use the data. All right. It's not just a piece of paperwork that you're just required to do. It's data that's going to be used. It's going to be entered into their database. It's going to be stuff that needs to be trackable, because not only do you have to report to the state, but the state has to report to EPA, because if they didn't have primacy, you'd be doing the same thing to EPA instead. So they've just made it easier.
Right. And if we're looking to see who has lead goosenecks, we're looking in this column for lead goosenecks, not this column. So it needs to be in our form.
It's a great question. Thank you, Ben.
Yep. So in discussion about the comment box, we do not have individual comments next to each individual service line. This is the kind of main comment field. So you can put things in here. If you run out of space, you can attach. If you need more space and you feel that you need to have more comments than this, reach out to me, reach out to Josh. We'll talk to you about what the situation is, and we'll come up with the best way to submit that information. And the good thing with this is you write it once and that's it. You don't have to write it every single time going down the inventory and all that sort of stuff. So you type this in, you type in information here. You physically cannot type elsewhere in this document. There's only select places you can type, because we don't need other stuff in other places. We're looking for very specific things in very specific places. So you type this in, you can type here, you don't have to, and then do not type here. This will be automatically calculated based on what you put in the inventory. Basic Excel stuff, right? You can scroll using these bars up and down, or use a scroll wheel on a mouse or a touchpad or whatever. If it looks too big or too small, likelihood is you can use these arrows to zoom out or zoom in. If you need it to be bigger print, you can do it that way. Or if it only, when you get into the inventory, if all you can see is one cell, then click on this minus button to zoom out a little bit. You need to be able to toggle between these three tabs. I've been taking for granted that I know how to do that, and I respect that not everybody uses Excel every day like we do, and that's completely fine. So toggling between the three tabs is really important. The first tab is the intro. You work left to right. There's the instructions here. This is basically everything from the inventory explained and identified, whether it's required or whether it's optional.
Sorry, this is a slight aside, but still, can the funding be used to cover additional DPW operator costs for the work to develop the inventory?
Megan?
Not unless you are a system that is already set up with the DWSRF program to do force accounts. If you don't know what I'm talking about, the answer is no. It's a very, very, very small number of systems that can do force accounts through the DWSRF program. But for the majority of water systems, the answer is no. The SRF funding cannot pay for what they consider O&M, and this is part of the operations and maintenance requirements for an operator, is to meet the requirements of any upcoming role. So no, the SRF money cannot pay for operator time or even board member time.
Thanks, Megan. And I forget where I was, but yeah, so instructions here. This is the column heading and explains what we're looking for and whether it's required throughout the document. And then you go over to the actual document here that you can scroll across with. If for some reason you don't see these three tabs, you can see these three dots. You might need to move this scrolling bar, especially if you're zoomed in, so you can see how those tabs kind of went away. You can click on the first one and the second one and the third one, but now I don't know where the other two went. These little green arrows here can go left and right through the different tabs. So just be aware if they don't always display, they're there. You just need to click on these green buttons in order to make them there. And I would suggest on these three little dots, clicking on it when it has those two bars and two arrows, meaning it can move either way, just moving it over here out of the way. And then when you scroll, it'll stay put. Digging into the document, kind of formatting a little bit by itself, we use what we call freeze panes. So as you're scrolling through the document, up and down, top to bottom, these column headings will always be in the same place. So these column headings will not move. I don't know what I just did. There we go. The column headings will not move. These will always stay here. And then as you go left to right, the address and the town will also stay there. So you know by the time you get way over here that you're still talking about one school street. So you shouldn't have to zigzag back and forth as you're doing this, and you're on the computer and then you're on your notes and you're on your computer and you forgot what address you are. So these will stay put. For the single building service line template, we put this reminder here that this is for single connection systems, single buildings. Really, you shouldn't have more than one entry in this document. I can't think of a reason you would have more than one entry. For now, just for training purposes, I'm just going to go through a dummy version of this. So let's say you have the school and it's only the school and it's a single building, and you can say it's 82 Main Street. So type in 82 Main Street, and let's just pick on Montpelier since I live in Montpelier, Vermont, state, city, zip. You can see, actually I'm going too fast. You can see as you start to type in the address, these orange boxes pop up. The orange boxes identify required information that needs to be in the document. So you need to be sure you type in, and when you type in the content, that orange goes away. So you want to make sure, I mean, that's one visual way we're going to get these and do a quick scan. And if there's orange stuff, we're going to probably kick it back to you to redo. So in the single building, the property span is required. The property span is an 11-digit number. I don't want to take the time to dig into the tool to find that, but it exists. And then let's say it's, needing at least 4 decimal places for the latitude and longitude. And let's say I forget to do the minus sign, it's going to say it needs to be between minus 73.5 and minus 71.2. Oh, right, I forgot the minus sign, and it's going to keep doing that until I put it in. Minus 72 point whatever. And then that'll satisfy that. Identify if there was a lead gooseneck or connector, yes, no, unknown. Scrolling over, you grab this bar and move left or right as you need to. Whether the service line is comprised of multiple materials, let's say no for this one. Was it ever previously lead? No, because it's only ever been black plastic. So we'll put HDPE, high density polyethylene piping is black plastic. And then there's only one material. So you don't have to put a second material. It's all black plastic. So you identify that it's black plastic is required. If there was a secondary material, you could put that, but just say not applicable. You could put the installation date. We would love for you to put month, day, and year if you know it. If you know it was installed in 1999, but you don't know the exact date, just put the year. There's a drop down for the diameter of the service line. If your diameter isn't included, you can put other. If you don't know, you can put unknown. Scrolling over again, what sources did you use to identify? And you can say, oh, we had water system records. So water system / municipal records. This is not galvanized, so nothing populates here. You can identify that it's a school building. The internal plumbing is galvanized. There's no other secondary, it's all galvanized, or maybe it's galvanized and copper. And then probably the most recent date. So if it's copper and galvanized, just put the most recent installation date. So you can put 2006, the copper was installed. So that's it for that entry. So if you're a single building, single connection system, that might be it. You go back here and you can see that there's total number of non-lead lines. And it's because I deleted parts of this, it's not calculating everything else correctly, but this does the count for you. It's a takeaway because we had the different entries. Yeah, it's because I started deleting stuff haphazardly that it's showing up a little incorrectly. So the multiple building setup is the same thing. There's the intro and summary. There's the water system WSID, the name of the system, the date, who completes it, comments if you need it. And then these fields will populate automatically. You physically cannot type in these spots. There's the instructions that will remind you what this is, what we're asking for, and how to fill it out. There's also another guidance document, standalone guidance documents, which goes through these with some of the kind of like single line diagrams that I had in the presentation to really drill into what we're looking for. And then it gets into the inventory. So I just pre-populated these. Some of this makes sense. Some of this is just completely made up, but you can see just how it would work. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to Vermont Span Finder, school property account number. I'm going to try to find, I don't know, some address once this loads. And this, this is GIS stuff. This is maps and things like that. So it could take a little while. And anytime I share my screen, my computer takes even longer to load this stuff. So I'm hopeful that it works, but it honestly might not today. Now, let me just try putting an address in here. So yeah, we'll just do the State Street, the State House again. There we go. So yeah, so put the address in the search bar. This is like Apple with Steve Jobs, or no, Windows with Bill Gates when the Windows crashed trying to do a demo of Windows. I think because I'm not in the right place for this. I don't think you use that search bar. I think you have to wait for this to load, and there's a search tool in this.
Ben, while that's doing that, somebody stated kind of as an additional to the, which do we have to use this spreadsheet, or can we make our own? They were just thinking about connecting that in with water system mapping and inventory into GIS. And he was wondering if there was any thought into creating a map that would allow users to use field maps or survey, like Survey 123, to collect the data. So it'd be similar to the ANR road erosion inventory map. I'm assuming we're kind of we're using what we have to use for right now.
Yeah, I don't want to restrict or prohibit anybody from doing that. That is all great. I would, if you want to do that on your own end and gather that information, it then needs to make its way into our form to be submitted to us. So if you want to do what you need to do to generate maps, that's completely fine. But we would need our form to be submitted to us and sent to us.
And talking theoretically right this second, I'm sure there's a way to not have to create two different documents. There's probably a way to populate your spreadsheet using information they're collecting using the GIS or any other program that they decide to use. I am just not that person to be able to say this can be done easily.
I'm sure it could be done. I can't tell you how to do it, and I don't think we can help you in doing it. But if you have that capacity and you want to look into it, go for it, for sure. All right, it's not loading for me, so this is a bad example. So I'm just going to make something up. So let's say we're going to do 5 School Street. So you can see as soon as I start typing, the orange pops up. Let's call Montpelier, just keep picking on them. I don't, we can't access the span finder right now, so I'm just going to put in numbers, but then we can do so what I did right there is I typed in 115 State Street into Google Maps, and then I clicked this layers button so that I can look at the satellite picture, because you don't necessarily always get the building when you look at the kind of cartoon map version. And then I just collapse this side panel there, scroll in using my mouse scroll. You can click and drag to move it. Let's say I know the service line comes in on this corner. I go to that corner and I right click and I get these numbers. That's the latitude and longitude. For this purpose, it's close enough. If you don't know that it goes into this corner, just go to a central location on that piece of property and make sure you report all of that information to us. 26247. So 44.26247, and then minus 70 something, 72,58041, 78,504. I don't know. I don't remember what I said. 58401. Nope. Minus 72,58401. And that's within the confines. That's in Vermont. It means you're not inventorying something in New York. Actually, no, I'm sorry. I did that wrong. Obviously, I'm a little rusty with this one. This one should have been where it connects to the water main. So those are the components that should have been here for where it connects to the building. So going back to Google Earth, you can say the water main is on State Street and it connects and goes cross country, give or take right about there. So right click there and it gives you the latitude and longitude there. So you establish that point and you establish this point. That's what we're looking for in this inventory document. So yeah, whatever, I'm just going to keep going. Let's say the water main, it's the big water main on State Street. I'm going to call it 10 inches and it is ductile iron. I'm making all of this up. I have no idea what's going on in Montpelier's system enough to know. But getting into the required information, does this have a lead gooseneck or pigtail or other connection? No, it doesn't. It's a 6-inch service serving a very big building. It doesn't have a lead gooseneck. Was it ever previously lead? No. Current line is made of what? I don't know. I'm making stuff up at this point. Let's call it copper. When was it installed? July 4th, 1992. Again, making stuff up. What's the diameter? I forget already what I said, but let's call it 4 inches.
Hey, Ben, you said that you know it's not lead because it's a 6-inch line. You may have already said this and I'm
Yep.
mixing up classes, but why do you know that?
If it's EPA said anything above 2 inches is not going to be lead. So if it's bigger than 2 inches, it won't be lead. It's just too big. The lead would collapse on itself.
Okay, there's another piece of logic for all of you guys. Thank you, Ben.
Yep. So 4 inches, it's a bigger pipe. So, a lot of schools that have sprinklers probably have newer service lines. Maybe they were lead and probably aren't now because they don't have the volume required for fire protection, things like that. Bigger connections probably aren't and haven't been lead because they're just not big enough. How do we know this? We have municipal records. So we've got city records for when State Street was developed, whatever. So that's the water system owned side. And now the property, the individual owner or the state owned side in this example. So the customer portion, let's just say it's copper the whole way. And it was installed, I forget what exactly I said, July 6, 1996 or whatever, whenever it was installed. And it's 4 inches still. And then what source of information is municipal records still, or we can call it a visual inspection. If you went with the water system operator went in, we can do it that way. It's a commercial building, so business or commercial. Were you denied access? Yes or no? No. We would love then to see this information, but you can see there's no orange cells and there's no red text. It's not required to be there, but we would love for it to be there so that we know whether you can sample from this location or not for the lead and copper rule in the future. So there is no treatment present. Internal plumbing is largely copper. Let's say it's an old building, so there's probably some galvanized also. And then interior plumbing will use the most recent install date. So copper inside was replaced in 97. Something, again, I'm making stuff up. Whether any of this makes actual sense isn't the point. It's just to go through the exercise to show you how the form works. And then you can see we can go back to here and it just keeps that running tally of total number of service lines, number of known not lead. And then up through here, I can show you that the reason some of these are populating because we don't know if this was lead. It's currently copper, but it's upstream of galvanized. So that would be galvanized requiring replacement. So then this is a yes. So then it's populating the galvanized requiring replacement through here automatically. So you don't have to do that tallying. So this is all kind of built in that it will do that count. It will calculate and identify whether it requires replacement or not, so that you don't have to make the judgment call. You just tell us what it is and the form and we will tell you what to do with it. And then the last one is the multiple building non-potable. So kind of regardless, if you have only one connection that's non-potable, just use this non-potable line. It's all the same basic stuff. It just, one of the big differences is it asks what the non-potable use is. So fire protection, industrial, like wash water for a brewery or something, irrigation for crops, flushing toilets or other. Just identify what they are and then just give us the same information we've asked for. I honestly don't know what we're going to do with this. If it's currently galvanized, you don't know whether it was lead. It's going to come out as saying galvanized requiring replacement, but in reality, I don't know what that means and what we're going to do with that at that point. So really don't worry about the non-potable as much. This is more just fact finding and gathering. And then the building type and whether you were refused access. We don't have all of the different things about treatment and years installed and that sort of thing, because you're not going to be sampling from that location. So that won't feed into the sampling plan. So we made this a little bit more abbreviated at only 24 columns, 25 columns. So let me see. I've got some notes here to make sure I talk about in this. Yeah. Let me go back to the multi-building. If you're one of those systems that says our system doesn't own any service lines or our system owns the entire service line, that's important. So current line material is where you would kind of flag this. Let's say the water system owns the entire service line from the main to the building inlet. You would identify what that service line is. Let's just call it copper and installed whenever. And then you go over here to the customer portion. you would identify not applicable. The system owns 100% of the service line. So there is no customer owned portion. It is all the system owned portion.
You bet.
Yeah.
Somebody asked, how do you determine what data is mandatory and which is not?
The red is required. And when you start typing an address, the orange is required. So these are mandatory. We've decided that between what we need and what the EPA needs as what is, we've drew the line as to what's required and what isn't. So anything that doesn't have that orange highlighting is strongly encouraged, but not required.
And it from what I've been able to tell, and I'm trying to dig into this, is that that information is supportive information. So when you make a comment that I looked at the mapping and it does not fall within, you know, the range of when lead might be installed, that the dates, the longitude, latitude, all that information is helpful, right?
Yeah, that's all, like, not required, but very helpful. Yep. And that's so we can get a better sense of what the system serves and what's going on and what the system infrastructure is and things like that. And then later, this all gets into trying to help identify the sampling plan. You know, ultimately, if you're like looking at this and you have a condo association that was built in 2002 and you think this is all foolish, it's not. It's important. You need to do this to document that you don't have lead lines. So even if you know there isn't lead, you still need to do this. You still need to document that there isn't lead. So that's still really important.
What if the homeowner, this is a question, what if the homeowner owns everything after the corporation stop?
I think it depends. So my understanding is that the corporation is at the main, right? That's the next thing off the main. Is that right? Is that the intended definition of corporation?
I'm waiting for them to respond, but that was my understanding. Yes.
Let's say yes.
Yes, they said yes.
At that point, if that's the case, so the homeowner owns everything from the main, basically, you would go through and you would identify, and that was going to be the next thing that I identified, is the current line material for the system owned portion is not applicable. The customer owns 100% of the service line. So then you'd go here and you'd have to identify what the customer portion, which is the whole shoot and match, what that is. So if the customer owns everything, the system says not applicable. If the system owns everything, the customer portion is not applicable. Yeah, I think that's right.
So it still has to be identified. You're just identifying, hey, I don't own this.
Correct. But they do. And it's made up of this, and it's in this location, and here's the age and that sort of thing. It still needs to be done, whether the system owns it or not. And like I was saying before, if this is within a college campus, I don't care if the college owns it and not the water system, it needs to be on the inventory. If there's water going into a building, it needs to be on the inventory.
Keep going. I'm sorry. That's it for right this second.
No, I think I'm good. Otherwise, okay, let me see. Yeah, I mean, I showed you the drop downs, I showed you everything else. So that's, kind of a takeaway, just kind of general computer stuff. Save often, save this often. I'd really hate for you to get 30 rows in and then lose it for some reason. So make sure you save this often and save it with something that makes sense, WSID, water system name and date, something like that, just so you can tell what it is and you can keep it separate. So that's everything that I plan to talk about today. We've got a few more minutes left for questions. For those wanting to know how to find this, where to find this, we've sent you emails with information about this already. But if you get a lot of email or don't read your email, it's all on this website. It's a lot of dashes and slashes and stuff. Just Google Vermont drinking water lead inventory, something like that. It'll pop right up. Honestly, it's a lot easier to use Google than it is to type in all this shenanigans. We will have much more information for you about funding. We will have more information and training about ANR online submission, and we will have more information about service line replacement plan templates. All of that is in the works, is coming very close. We want to give you the information so you can start gathering resources. You can start, figuring out a game plan. We would love it if you are able to get started now. That'd be awesome. We will be providing either the contractors or a loan to get your own contractor, but don't feel compelled to do that. If you don't want to, if you're a small enough system and just want to handle it and be done with it, that's great. I applaud that. But understand that there are resources coming. So gather what you can, get ready to go, so that when the contractor shows up, you're not scratching your head wondering if you still have the files in the attic type thing or whatever. So get as much as you can gathered, start getting a game plan for this, and then we will be back in touch as soon as we can, as soon as we get some folks onboarded with us to do this, and as soon as the loan program and the funding program is better hammered out.